Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty live. She made an announcement publicly late yesterday afternoon that I think caught a lot of people by surprise. It would be fair to say that she has chosen not to run for re-election, not seeking a second term, and that sets the course now for the next 17 months, which she has left in her tenure, and then sets the stage for voters to choose a new attorney in 2026. And this is a position that traditionally has been held for years and years, sometimes decades even. And so this is, we have a lot to talk about, and we'll be talking with Hennepin County Attorney Moriarty here. And it sounds like we're ready to go. So Mary Moriarty joining me now. Thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate your time.
Thank you for inviting me to be here.
Absolutely. So I think fair to say I just mentioned a surprise to a lot of people. So I'm curious, why make this announcement now?
It probably is a surprise because I think we often see people in elected positions continue to seek that role over and over, or another role. I made the decision now because it's about time that I had to decide whether I'm running for re-election, because you have to start campaigning pretty early, and that means fundraising. It means talking to delegates, meeting with people, and that's a lot of time. It's like a full-time job, in fact. And so when I thought about how I wanted to spend my last year and a half in office, and did I want to campaign or did I want to do the actual work, it was much more important to me to do the work.
Was there a turning point along the way that kind of made this decision for you?
No, I was being asked, am I going to run for office again? And so I really had to think about that. I talked to people I trust, my partner. I thought about it. I like to sit with decisions for quite a while and think about them, think about the pros and cons. And so it was more of a process. And when I got to the point where I felt comfortable with the decision, that's when I was comfortable telling people.
Yeah, I kind of read through the Star Tribune article. They had a chance to interview you as well. And you know, they talked about, and I think one of the things people want to know from you is, you know, taking a lot of heat in your tenure, charging decisions. We're going to talk about some of that in just a minute, but I'm curious how much that very loud criticism influenced you not to run again.
The criticism, not at all. I certainly expected pushback. Anytime you come into a system that's very entrenched in the way it does things, and you try to come in and change things, and you do change things, people are going to push back. People who like the system the way it is are going to push back. People who are just unfamiliar with how you're doing things are also going to wonder what you're doing. So there was nothing about the pushback that led me to make this decision. It's just, for me, about the work. The work is the most important thing to me, and I wanted to spend time, my remaining time, doing the work. And I also wanted to remove myself from the equation, hopefully, so that, I mean, all too often people make me a controversy instead of actually talking about the thing and the approach that we're doing. So I'm hopeful that by removing myself from that position, people can actually focus on and understand the work that we're doing, because every day, everybody in this office is doing really great work.
If I could take you back to when you first decided you wanted to run for this office, I mean, I'm curious, did you ever foresee that, you know, you would become more of a storyline? You know, what back then made you want to run?
I wanted to run because I had worked in the same system for 30 years. I mean, I've spent my entire career in the Hennepin County criminal legal system. And every day I saw things that I thought we could change. And so running for county attorney, to me, seemed like the best way that I, with my experience in the criminal legal system, especially in Hennepin County, because I know this system really well, that is really where I could focus on change that I knew would lead to public safety, because the office in the past has been sometimes more focused on politics and political decisions instead of actually doing the thing that would keep the community safer. There was also the murder of George Floyd. I had certainly been working with people, community members, who had talked about things that had happened to them that were done by police. And I think people had a really hard time in the community, some people in the community, believing that that was actually happening until maybe Philando Castile and then George Floyd. And so I saw an opportunity there for a reckoning about policing and our criminal legal system, racism. And I thought, here's a good opportunity to get into this office and to implement some changes that I knew would help actually victims more, because I saw how victims were treated. I saw that we didn't treat trauma much at all. So all of those things combined to make me want to run for this office.
And you just mentioned in your answer, you felt that it was political decisions were being made. And that a criticism of your tenure would be that maybe you were too progressive, and we can talk about a couple of things if you don't mind. And again, I appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate you being open to just answering any questions that we have. And I just feel like this is a good place, a good format to be able to hear from you without us editing things up and letting you kind of talk. But one of the most controversial, I guess, decisions during your tenure was the charging decision for Trooper Ryan Londrigan. So for those who don't know, he shot and killed a motorist, Ricky Cobb II. Initially, you had charged Londrigan with murder and manslaughter. Later, though, dropping those charges, citing new evidence. We saw law enforcement coming out to support Trooper Londrigan at the courthouse. We don't usually see that kind of thing. It really created a lot of headlines, a lot of talk there. I'm curious if you can take us through what happened in that period of time, and kind of just help those watching from the outside understand.
Sure, and I'm happy to be on here. I'm very transparent about what we do, and I love talking about the work that we're doing. So, unfortunately, Ricky Cobb was shot and killed by the trooper. And this could be a very long story, so I'm going to make it relatively short. We ended up charging the trooper at the time. We believed we had a very good case. Part of the issue, I will say, is that many in law enforcement were not cooperative with the BCA, so the Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Or apprehension, excuse me, is the entity that investigates shootings by law enforcement. And there were people in law enforcement that would not cooperate with the BCA. Now, if somebody's at risk of being charged in the case, of course they have a right not to cooperate. But we were talking about people who were not at jeopardy, not at risk of being charged. And so it was very difficult to collect all the information that we needed, because the BCA wasn't able to collect that information because some people were not being helpful. So we charged, and then you mentioned the fact that law enforcement was a large presence, and that really hadn't been seen before. That was a very new strategy, I believe, in these kinds of cases. We've seen it in other cases across the country. One of the things that I thought, and I've always felt badly about, is that the Cobb family had to walk through law enforcement and some people holding signs that made derogatory comments about Ricky Cobb, and that law enforcement just came to the defense of Trooper Londrigan. I do know that there are people in law enforcement who do not believe, or who believe, that Ricky Cobb should be alive today. But in terms of the case, we kept getting more information until at some point the defense introduced some affidavits way late into the case, which we decided made it very difficult for us to overcome defense of others' claim. In fact, the trooper was saying that he defended his partner. And so we decided at that point to dismiss the case. Now, we had probable cause. We were about to set a trial date. I can't remember if we did have a trial date. We were about to set a trial date. But we certainly had enough evidence we could have gone forward. But what I've always told people in this office, and what I've always said publicly, when we get a case, if we have the information that we have, we charge it. And if things change throughout the pendency of the case, we are always supposed to evaluate where we are at any given time. I saw far too often cases being tried in the past administration simply because they had been charged. And there was an unwillingness to revisit what was currently happening in the case. And I didn't want to do that. So what we did was to evaluate, will we be able to overcome the defense of others? We decided we did not have enough evidence to do that. And we did the ethical thing, which was to dismiss it.
There usually have been undercurrents, other side stories here, but it was reported at the time that Governor Walz had said that had you not dismissed that case, that it would have been essentially taken from you. Is that true? And how do you feel about that?
I believe that to be true. I have many feelings about it. As I said, I am very sad for this community and for the Ricky Cobb family that the governor was making comments about this case without knowing anything about it. The governor never called me. The governor, I don't know how he thought he knew about this case. He certainly never talked to me. And yet he's making cases, responding to law enforcement, saying things without knowing all of the details of this case, and then decided at some point to take the case away, I'm guessing with the intent to dismiss it. It's very problematic. My opinion is that he was doing that to pander to law enforcement, and which is interesting because law enforcement will, I don't think, ever support him. But he was doing it to pander to law enforcement, and that is not, so for political reasons, and that is not the reason to take a case from a county attorney, from any county attorney in Minnesota. In fact, throughout the country, county attorneys, the legal organizations have said that elected officials are supposed to honor the independence of prosecutors because we are elected by the people in the county. I was elected by 16 points by the people of Hennepin County. The governor should not be coming in and taking away a case just because, well, and for political reasons, frankly, but he is taking away the people of Hennepin County's decision that I am the prosecutor here and that I am going to make the decisions that I think are appropriate. So I think a governor taking away a case for political reasons is incredibly inappropriate and takes away trust in the system and takes away the ability of an office. I live in this community. I live in Minneapolis. And it's a really slippery slope when you start having politicians interfere with elected officials who are elected by their own counties to make the decisions. If the people, the voters of Hennepin County, don't like that decision, then the consequences for me or any other prosecutor should be the next election.
You'd mentioned when we were talking about the Londrigan case, you'd mentioned Ricky Cobb II's family and some of the emotions that you had and thoughts that you had for them. And I wanted to kind of ask you about, the other, I think, probably big criticism, just sort of as big as the other one, we'll kind of hit on these two, is people have accused you of being too lenient on juvenile offenders. And specifically, I'm just thinking about the Hussein Braveheart case. He was 15. He and another teen involved in a deadly carjacking. He ended up reaching a plea deal, which kept him out of prison. And so, some people might say, well, we care about the victims in this case. How about, the family of the victim in that case? Who's standing up for them in that case? How would you answer that?
So I care about people who are harmed in every case. And I meet with families very often whose loved ones have been lost. Caring about a family, caring about somebody who's been harmed does not equate to public safety. Our office does not represent victims, and I would pose this question: should somebody get a sentence dependent on whatever, if a family comes? Some of our victims don't have families, so should the person who harmed them get a different kind of sentence simply because nobody's there to speak on their behalf? And I understand families are grieving. I've met with any number of them. I can't imagine what that's like, but they are grieving, and they're, whatever they want to ask for, whatever they think is appropriate, they should ask for. I had one mom ask for the death penalty, and I get that. I get that, but that is not something we have in Minnesota, nor is it something I believe in. As prosecutors, we're supposed to try to take the emotion out of it. And if we are truly focused on public safety, then what we must look at in that Braveheart case is this: what is in the best interest of public safety? That's a very different conversation than should there be punishment, because everybody's been historically told that the measure of someone's harm is the length of the prison sentence. And so people get into this, well, this person needs to be punished. But that is not public safety. Public safety is looking at the person before you and trying to figure out, using the best tools and information that you have, is there a way that we can rehabilitate this person? Is this person rehabilitated? What can we do to try to ensure that the public that he won't come back, that he won't harm someone? Hussein Braveheart was a young man who spent from the age of 15 to 20 in jail because it took the courts quite a while to make a decision in his case. And I think many people don't know this, but the original judge, the judge who actually heard his case in juvenile court, did not think he should be certified. There were experts, psychologists who testified at his hearing, his certification hearing, who said that he needed several years of intensive therapy and supervision. He got that. In the 5 years that he was in jail waiting for the Supreme Court's decision to come down, he got all of the things that the experts recommended that he needed to move towards rehabilitation. So he was 20 years old when I came into the picture. And so the question that was posed to me was, should we send him to prison? He's going to get out. He's going to be much worse than he was, because we know it's very traumatizing for people to go to prison. But should we send him to prison for reasons of punishment? And I decided that we should not, because we are supposed to be in juvenile court focused on rehabilitation. And all of the information we had from the experts, from people who watched him in all of these programs, were that he was on the road to rehabilitation. And so should we just take that away and send him to prison, or should we continue to support rehabilitation? And the decision I made was to continue to allow him to support rehabilitation. Now, do I have a crystal ball? Do I know what will eventually happen? No. But I know that he's much more likely, if he gets the things that he needs, not to come back into the system if we go this route. So I would say to that, if we are actually invested in public safety, what's safer for the community, then keeping him on probation was the right thing to do. If we want to have a conversation about what punishment should be, that's a different conversation, but we should just be honest. We are not talking about public safety if we're focused on punishment.
Serious juvenile offenders with serious crimes, violent crimes, has been something that we have talked a lot about. The headlines have been just kind of screaming at us the last few years, carjackings and things like that. I'm curious, and even our investigative team, Paul Bloom, has done a deep dive. He had a whole series called Nowhere to Go, where we talk about just the system-wide failure, the infrastructure failure that we have here in the state to adequately take care of / rehabilitate these young offenders. Where do they go? I'm curious, through your eyes, what have you seen, and where do we even start to make some progress in that space?
Yeah, Paul Bloom did an excellent job on that story, and it is a total systems failure. I think where people get confused maybe is because it is very complicated. We have a number of youth in the system. The youth that Paul's story was about are usually 10, 11, 12, 13, and they have committed violent crimes. And what happens is, if we charge them, or when we have charged them, they are found not by us, but by a psychologist, to be incompetent to proceed. What that means is, whether you are a child or an adult, we cannot proceed with criminal charges against you unless you are legally competent. And the issue arises that you got kids. I mean, think about this, Amy. Like if you were trying to describe something complex like the legal system to a 10-year-old or 11-year-old, do you think that they would really understand it? Right. And just developmentally, they typically do not. So many of those kids are incompetent. What that means is that they cannot be held at the juvenile detention center legally. They cannot be held. Some of the hearings that Paul has been on, the county is actually holding young people in the JDC illegally. Yeah. The issue is this: if we cannot prosecute them because they're not competent, what is done with those kids? And our frustration is this. In the past, far too often they've been let out in the care of mom, grandma, parents, whatever, and then they continue to engage in violent, risky behavior. And we have advocated over and over that there needs to be placements for those kids who are not safe to be in the community, because they do continue to engage in behavior that's inappropriate and risky. We don't have those resources right now, but I would say I and our office have been a leading advocate for those resources, because it's a small group of kids, by the way, but any MPD officer, our office can tell you the names of those children. And there needs to be something done, but there aren't the resources now. Where I would say my frustration comes in is that there are many unhelpful narratives out there. And I know you've heard them, and I know you've interviewed the chief. And sometimes he tends to talk about a revolving door, claiming that we don't charge kids and that kind of thing. And I think that's very unhelpful and not true. And it's one of those narratives I talked about in my video and when I interviewed with Strib. We need to have candid conversations about what's actually happening in the system. And that doesn't mean we're pointing fingers. It means we need to identify the gaps in the system. So let's give car theft as an example. In 2023, I think we had about 7,500 car thefts in Minneapolis. The Minneapolis police were able to bring us for potential charging less than 2% of those cases, so less than 200. We know, or research says, deterrence is really about the certainty of being caught. Deterrence is actually not about long sentences or sentences. It is about whether you think you're going to get caught. So if you are somebody stealing cars and you know the certainty of getting caught is less than 2%, there's absolutely no deterrence there, right? So, and these are also cases where, sometimes there's a lot of blame put on our office or the judicial system, but we traditionally haven't been able to do anything if the police aren't bringing us a case. And so, and I've heard the chief say this, that, oh, it's the same juveniles. And I've heard you interview him where it's the same juveniles and nothing ever happens to them. And I kind of wish I could jump through the screen and say, Chief, how many of those juveniles have you actually submitted to our office for charging? How many? Because the truth of the matter is car theft is very difficult for police to solve for a number of really good reasons. Often they're a group of kids, they're wearing the same clothing, they all ditch the car, they run away. People who have cars stolen may not have a good description. There are all kinds of really good reasons why police are having a hard time sending us cases for potential charging. But that also means we have to be honest about it, that they're not sending us these cases for charging. And so we need to look at, which we did, what can we do then? And this is where our, I think, one-of-a-kind program in the country, our Youth Auto Theft Initiative, came into being. Because we heard from law enforcement across Hennepin County that they were having a hard time getting us cases to charge. But we were also being told by crime analysts that the time, and we're talking about kids 10, 11, 12, 13, the time it takes for them to escalate into more violent behavior is a matter of months. So before I came into office, if the police could not bring us a case to charge, we would have said there's nothing that we could do. But we couldn't live with that, knowing that the behavior would escalate into harm against somebody else. So we created an initiative where we said to police, we know you can't bring us the cases, but we also know you know the names of these kids. If you could just give us the names, we will run them through our databases. We'll see if they're getting any services from the county at all. And what was surprising to me was that half those young people were not receiving services. So we used our social worker at the time, and now it's embedded social workers, but we're able to reach out to the parent, the guardian, and say, hey, your kid's on our radar screen. What do you think of that? And 100% of those parents said, I know, I'm not surprised my kid's on your radar screen, please help. And at that point, we could then refer to various services, whether it was mental health, housing security, substance use, whatever that family and that child needed to try to stabilize the situation so that kid would not be stealing cars. And after a year and about 3 months, we looked at the data, and that had a success rate of 81%. And I challenge anybody to come up with probably better statistics than that in the criminal legal system. I think right now, we started that in my first year. We're probably at 67, 62%, something in there. But that is an example of an effective program, an effective intervention where we are actually reaching out to kids whose cases aren't coming to us, and we're offering them services through the county that help them keep out of the system. So I'm a big believer in really talking about the truth of what's happening, where any of our departments might be having problems, getting us cases, solving cases and stuff like that. And so that has been a frustrating narrative when it's more pointing fingers at us or the courts, when we really ought to be talking about what the issue is. And if I move back to those incompetent kids, here is a place where police and us and others could say, hey, we see these kids all the time. We know they're out here. We know they desperately need help. They have complex needs. You guys got to do something. We could all join in that, and it would be an effective narrative. It would be something that the community should expect from us, to work together to speak in a united voice about what we need to keep the community safer. But that hasn't happened because of these narratives of pointing fingers at everybody else.
Mary, would you be open to having a conversation with the chief and us, and we can kind of talk through some of these things? I know you watch some things, he watches some things, and I hear from both of you, and it might be nice to get you in the same space to talk about these things.
Yeah, I'll tell you this, he will not return my call. He won't. I'd be happy to sit in the same space as him. I'd be happy to talk about what's actually happening. He does not return my call, and has not for probably over a year. And I tried really, really hard. I can't speak to why he doesn't speak to me. I can't speak to why MPD will not do a press conference with us on joint things that we're doing together, because we are doing some great work together. And we have tried to get them to participate in press conferences with us, because we think the community ought to know what we are doing to partner together, and they refuse to do that. So I am happy to sit in a room with the chief. I also very much do not want a narrative that's about me. And what I want is for us to be doing the work that keeps the community safer. And what I will say is that our office, our people work with MPD every day. We have pretty good working relationships with them. And we're doing, we have an embedded prosecutor. We put a prosecutor over in MPD to help with sexual assaults. And because those are a big concern to me, we know that those can be really tough cases, and we wanted to help MPD be able to identify cases and how they could be working on them better, because we're invested in community safety. But at one point we asked MPD if they wanted to do a press conference with us on that, and they refused. So this has been, like I said, it's been part of my frustration that the narrative becomes, oh, I'm pointing fingers at him or something like that. My relationship with it, I'm always willing to work with anybody. If whatever their issues are, I want our departments to work together, which we do. But I think it's in the best interest of the people in Minneapolis and Hennepin County for us to also be talking about the narratives that we need to talk about. and actually joining in asking for the resources that we all know we need, especially for young people.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question about just, I guess,
Sure.
more of a personal question about kind of how you feel about things as a person, because we see you with this hat, right, the Hennepin County Attorney hat, and people, politicians, people who are in the news headlines all the time tend to become caricatures, and narratives tend to shape, whether it's the chief or you or whomever. I'm curious if do you feel the level of, I guess I'll use the word vitriol sometimes. I mean, do you read comments? Do you see it? Do you feel it? How are you feeling when you see that stuff?
Yeah, it's hard. I try not to read comments, but it's hard to avoid seeing it. And it's hurtful. It's hurtful. For one thing, it's hurtful to my family. It's also jeopardized my safety and the safety of my partner and my family. And so I don't know if people really stop to think. I mean, people think that they can say anything about me, write anything about me. And I think that's a little bit about the era we're in here, where people don't seem to stop and think, I'm a human being. I have a family, cares about me. I care about my safety. So yeah, it is really hurtful. But I think that we can all do better at stepping up and saying when politicians, especially, or elected, whoever, are saying things that are misleading and, egg people who tend to do those kinds of things and say those kinds of things on. We, I think, owe it to our community to put out accurate narratives and really acknowledge what the issues are in the system, even if they're our own department. I mean, we probably have plenty of areas where we could improve. And I think really the sign of a strong leader is to acknowledge those, be transparent about them, work to try to improve them, and definitely work with other partners, because fundamentally, this is why I got into this work. I want to work with other people to keep the Minneapolis I'm a part of safer, Hennepin County safer, and that is what the voters deserve.
Yeah, and the voters who voted you in, I mean, you mentioned at the time it was, coming out as the wake of George Floyd. It was that society felt a little bit different, culture felt a little bit different, feelings toward law enforcement were changing, and everything was just really, really raw. And then during your tenure, it almost feels like, and this is just me anecdotally looking at it and saying, it almost feels like it's kind of swinging maybe back another way as we look at a divided nation that voted in a conservative president now. Do you feel that? Do you feel like as you're now, and you have 17 months left, so we're not cutting your time short here, but do you feel like as you're leaving, the world has kind of changed, society has kind of changed, and we're in a much different place right now and will be when you're leaving?
Well, the pendulum has definitely changed and shifted. I sometimes think, am I still living in the same Minneapolis where George Floyd was murdered? But I think that narrative is intentional. And I believe in my heart that the voters, the people in Hennepin County, and this is why they elected me by 16 points, really, and this makes sense. Everybody wants to be safe. And I believe that the people of Hennepin County want to be safe. I also believe that they just weren't aware that the system really wasn't keeping them safe, or that there were other things that we could be doing. And so when I come in here and I'm doing things in a different way that are actually about keeping us safer and creating a more equitable system, people are really susceptible to fear mongering. And a lot of people take advantage of that. But I truly believe, everybody wants to see the system work better. There's interesting research out there where if you ask a person, do you feel safe in your particular neighborhood? And oftentimes they'll say yes. Well, what about crime elsewhere? Oh, crime elsewhere is horrible. And so we have a problem right now, and I don't think this is anything new, where crime has actually gone down. The trends in car thefts have gone way down. So crime has gone way down, also across the nation. And what's happened here in Minneapolis and Hennepin County is happening across the nation as well. It's not new to me, necessarily, it's not new to us, but it's all happening in other places. And I think to the extent that fear mongering just makes people frightened. There's a perception of crime that's very different than the reality of crime. But having said that, I want to say it doesn't help somebody who's been the victim of a carjacking or some type of violent crime to say, oh, violent crime is going down. That does not help that person. And so we need to do a much better job of trying to make sure that that person is never harmed in the first place. And that's where a lot of our preventative rehabilitative programs come in. But we also do hold people accountable. And we send people to prison every day, probably. And I think people would be surprised to hear that because there's a false narrative about being soft on crime and that kind of thing. And I think early on you asked me about, am I progressive or what's my philosophy? My philosophy is about being effective on crime, effective public safety. And I think, I have a podcast called We Don't Have to Choose. And I called it that because people seem to think there's a big divide. On one end of the spectrum, there's public safety. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there's me or people who want reform, when actually those things are the same. If you look at all of the data, the research on what we have been doing, what we could be doing, what other places are actually doing, the reforms, the changes that we are doing are actually about keeping us safe.
And I know I want to be respectful of your time here. As we kind of close things out, I am curious, as we look to the next 17 months, what does that reform look like to you? Can you give us some examples of things that we may see that are a little bit more kind of tangible to those of us looking for more safety?
Yes, and I'm very excited about it. Now that I'm not having to campaign, I'm really excited about doing the work. Sometimes there are really superficial things that people talk about, change making, but they really don't actually fundamentally change the system or how we're approaching things. We have been working quite a while, sometimes months, sometimes years, at changing policies. We always look at data. We look at what people are doing across the country. We think about our circumstances here in Minneapolis and Hennepin County. And then we do a lot of vetting with our staff. We're thinking about doing this. What do you think about that? And so one thing that we are going to unroll pretty soon here is a different approach to emerging adulthood. For instance, everybody knows, who's around young people, knows that when they suddenly turn 18, they're not suddenly grown up. They're treated legally as an adult. And the legal system says, hey, up until 18, you're a youth, and then 18, you're an adult. But we know that's not real life. And so one of the things I'm excited about is creating some teams here that have lawyers who are really invested in understanding what actually works with youth. I'm very excited about some programs that are happening across the country involving domestic violence and youth in the ages of 18 to 25 and how we can better intervene so that violence is interrupted. So we're going to focus on things like that. And that's not to say that we are going to be sending youth to prison or young people, emerging adults to prison because they aren't safe in the community. That is going to be a reality of what we're doing. But we also, with those cases that are presumptive probation or cases where we just know that there are effective ways, and we know they're effective because they're being implemented in other places, that they are effective in keeping people from coming back. And that's what people want. They want somebody who comes into the system not to come back because that means they're not out doing the same thing in the community. And so that's one of the things that we're going to be focused on. And it's taken us many months to do all the research, to look into that, to feel confident about that. It also mirrors what probation has been doing for a while. They have TAY units, transition-aged youth. So they're also focusing on the particular needs of ages 18 to 25. And so that's an exciting space for us to be in, to really try to implement some interventions that are effective so we can make sure that people in those age groups are not coming back. And as I said, sometimes when I talk about innovations, people think we're never going to send anybody to prison. And that's simply not true. We are just going to be looking at ways of intervening, as probation has, in more effective ways.
We've talked about some of the things you're going to be doing. We talked about the auto theft early intervention initiative. We didn't even have a chance to talk about the expungement clinics for people who've completed their sentences as well. That's another piece of something that your office has done that I know we've done some stories on. I think we were up in Moorhead when they had one up there, and there are some really great success stories here. I'm curious, do you have any regrets as you look back? At your time, you're not done yet, but at this time, what kind of goes through your mind? Like, I wish I would have done this better. I wish I wouldn't have responded to this person, or anything like that come to mind?
Yeah, I think as a leader of an organization, we also always have to have the humility to think, that didn't maybe go as well as I wanted to. But what I tell our staff here, when they're looking at cases, I want them to make the best decision that they can make at the time with all of the information that they have. But we don't have crystal balls, and it's human behavior. And so we do the best we can. Sometimes it goes the way we want it to go. Sometimes it doesn't. And I think the way I describe it to people here is, I want you to learn. I want you to learn. What could you have done differently? What could we do better? And I try to do that too. I mean, obviously, there are all kinds of things that I'm thinking, well, I wish, I might have done something differently, but how did I get to that decision? What can I do differently? And I will say that's an important part of the culture of this office too. When I came here, people were very afraid that if they did something that went wrong, they would be punished in some way. And I have made it very clear to people, and I've shown people, I want them to be prepared. I want them to get the information that they need. I want them to be educated about the things that work and don't work. And then I want them to make a decision. And then we have to live with it. And sometimes that can be hard. But punishing people for not being able to predict human behavior after they've made the best decision is not what I think is helpful for people who are already doing very stressful work here. And so I think it's created a very different work environment for us. But for myself, I'm always looking at even things that go well. I think, what could we have done better? How could we have reached more people? I was at a town hall. I was talking about our youth auto theft initiative, and a woman said, why have we never heard of this? And it was kind of like, well, I've had a press conference. We tried to talk about it. So sometimes it's, what can we do to get that narrative out there? I am always thinking about my decision making and always trying to figure out how to improve, always open to suggestions from my team about how to improve. So I think if you say as a leader, no, there's nothing I would do differently, you either don't have good insight or you're not being honest.
Have you thought about what's next for you?
I have not, but what I can say is I am very committed to system change, and it will probably be something involving that. But I'm really excited about the next year and a half of my term. We have a lot of really wonderful things that we're working on that I know will make a difference in people's lives. And so I get to spend the next year and a half doing that.
Will you run for office again in any way, shape, or form?
No, I told people when I ran, and I still feel this way, and I do want to make this point. I had never run for office before, never wanted to run for office before. I wanted this position, which required me to run for office, but I always made it clear. One of the things that I thought was incredibly damaging to this office was that decisions were all too often made for political reasons, because this office has often been used as a stepping stone for some other position, and that's been very obvious in who's had it. But we're talking about what's supposed to be the criminal justice system, right? And so how do we justify decisions involving what is justice by letting politics or what's safe influence our decision making? So I was very honest about that. I was going to do my very best to remove politics from decision making. I wasn't looking for some other office. I am not. And I am very proud to say in 2.5 years, I have not made a decision or signed off on a decision for political reasons. And I think that that's very new to people. I mean, I told people what I would do when I ran. I've done it. And I'm very pleased with that, because I think that's the role this office should have, is trying to make decisions based on the information, the best research, best practices, not because it might be the safe thing to do politically.
Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty, thank you for your time today. I know it's been a whirlwind for you guys, probably a lot of calls coming in here in the last almost 24 hours or so. We appreciate you spending some time with us and sharing some insight. And we'll work on getting you and the chief together. I'm going to work on that. So,
thank you so much.
Okay, we'll talk to you soon. Thank you. All right.
Bye.
Bye. Okay, and that's going to wrap up this couple of hours of All Day Live. We appreciate you being with us today. We